We all have trauma to work through. Often we have to show up for our inner world and care for our inner world while living our outer life. You don't have to rip off the Band-Aid all at once. You are going to still maintain your coping mechanisms for a while. And
Gabby Bernstein, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for carving a little time out of your super busy book promotion schedule to chat with my audience. I'm super honored to have you.
Thank you, my friend. And it's such a privilege always to be in your presence. And lately we connect mainly through these kinds of interviews, but lately, like in the last 2 years, but it's such a nice selfish moment for me because while we're doing a podcast, it's just nice to be with you. Your presence is very soothing.
I haven't seen you in person since Serenbe, when we both were at the Attune festival, which was a few months before the pandemic started.
It was right before. We really just made it.
We don't know each other super well, but I've known you for quite a while, and I've gotten a chance to see you working and also get to experience you behind the scenes. And to me, you come across, there's really not a lot of difference. And being someone who also gives a lot of talks and presentations and workshops, it was a relief to kind of see your behind the scenes process, because you go into quite a bit of detail in the book. And especially the part about, you talking to crowds of thousands of people and then going home and being sort of aloof with your partner. I thought it was just me, but I read that
about for some of us, it's a lot easier to be that vulnerable in front of strangers. And you know what I learned about that chapter is so beautiful, because what I mentioned in that part was that I'm live in front of this big audience of people, and I'm so comfortable being vulnerable. And I go home and I'm actually now shut down and turned off and like in this mode of controlling everything. But what I came to realize was at that time, being live and vulnerable was safe for me, because that's when I was in control. I was the conductor of the energy of that audience. I called the shots. My energy was holding the room. So that for me at the time was the safest place for me to be vulnerable, because it was when I was the most in control.
Well, you also talk a lot about the postpartum depression that you experienced, and that one moment where it all came to a head and you had to cancel one of your talks, which is like the cardinal sin of anyone who's trying to.
Never done it in my life. I'd never, 16 years. At that time it had been, 14 years of speaking, 20 years of speaking, but 14 years of speaking as a spiritual teacher. And I've never canceled a talk in my entire life. And that, leave it to that to be my bottom, not like the suicidal ideation or the, insomnia, but that I missed a talk. And for whatever reason, that was the moment when I really hit my knees and was like, I have to get a proper diagnosis, and I can't run from this anymore.
Yeah. No, it was really beautiful. Just the whole thing. I mean, we could go on. We don't have that much time, so I don't want to go too deep into any of these. And plus, people should read it in context. Having written 8 books prior to this and been in therapy, how did you know this was the time to reveal this level of vulnerability?
Good question. In the book, I share a very, very personal story about remembering trauma, childhood trauma. And I remembered it when I was 36 years old, and that was in 2016. And at the time, I remember saying, and I write about this in the book, I said to my speaking coach, I need to speak about this. 1 in 4 women, 1 in 3 or 4 women have had this experience. So many men have had this experience. I need to speak. I need to get out. And she was like, hell no. Stop. Do not speak about this until you are grounded in your recovery. Because if I had, I would be not only re-traumatizing myself, but traumatizing my audiences. And so while it's come out in moments along the way and interviews with our friends like Lewis Howes and folks, it's been a part of my storyline that I've shared. Truly writing this book, while it was something I wanted to do in 2016, could not come out until now because I'm on the other side. And I wrote this book in 2020. sitting in the seat of a lot of recovery, sitting in the seat of years of therapy and spiritual growth. And then at that point, 4 solid years of 3 therapy sessions a week of full-blown resurrection, reprocessing, coming out of those dark wounds that had been so buried and returning to that safety within myself. And so I said this over and over on every single interview. And, it was funny. I was on the Today Show yesterday and Hoda said to me, "Can you recover from trauma?" And I said, I would not put my face on the cover of this book with the subtitle, "The Guided Path from Trauma to Profound Freedom and Inner Peace," if I didn't believe that was true, if I didn't know that to be true in my body. So every single one of us have experienced trauma with a big T, trauma with a small t. We all woke up today and witnessed bombs going and, sirens going off in Ukraine. We're, on the precipice of big, horrific events in this world. We've lived through a worldwide pandemic. You cannot be alive right now and say you've never experienced trauma because we're living in this moment. And so we have to do our part to regulate our own nervous system, to support our energy field, and to heal those wounded parts of us that have been begging to come forth. And it's possible.
Well, that was one other part of the book that really stood out for me. It was near the end when you talked about your journey with having to, not having to, but going on antidepressants as a result of the postpartum depression. And then having that realization that that person that you got to write the blog post years and years ago, who wanted to mention that she was taking antidepressants, you told her to take that out of the article. Then you called her up and apologized.
I was part of the stigma. Yeah. I stayed for 4 months, not medicated, not with the right diagnosis, suicidal ideation, insomnia, agoraphobia, extreme anxiety attacks, and depression for months, for the first 4 months of my son's life. Did not get a proper diagnosis because I was trying to fix it with meditation. I was trying to fix
you're the spiritual.
I was trying to fix it with all the wellness tools that I had built up. And that's all beautiful. And I was brought up homeopathic. I was brought up to meditate. I know that I can be a source of healing for my body and myself. But when you're having a biochemical condition, if somebody listening right now is suffering with a diagnosis of anxiety, depression, postpartum, you must recognize that God is in everything. God is in the therapist. God is in the psychiatrist. God is in light. God is in the book. God is in the fucking medication when you need it. And so it's like that parable, God sends the boat and the guy's drowning and God's sending the boat and he's sending the raft and the guy drowns and he's like, "Where were you?" And God's like, "I sent you a fucking boat." I had to finally get on the boat. And I really speak very openly about that. I also talk about how I believe I was part of the stigma by saying to people, let's not talk about that. Let's not write about that on the blog. We don't want to engage in that conversation. Oh my God, I can't even believe that those words came out of my mouth and that was the perception that I had. And I'm grateful that I was able to remedy that with my employee that had written this blog, and it's all in the book. You got to read the book.
So what would you say, just as a final question, what would you say people still get wrong about you, about Gabby Bernstein, being so open and vulnerable as you are?
What a good question. What do people get wrong about me? I don't really even know these days. I think maybe in the past people had we place perceptions onto people based on how they look or how they dress or what they, so maybe there's been people in my career that have said to me, "Wow, at first glance, I didn't think that you could go this deep," and when you actually hear me open my voice, you're like, deep is the only place I go. So it's only big talk here.
So how do you know when you've transitioned from trauma to profound freedom and inner peace? For anyone else who's going through that process and is feeling overwhelmed, just thinking that I don't know if I'm ever going to get through this and show up for my job and show up for my family and all of that.
Well, first and foremost, I think it's really important that I mention 2 things. One, we all have trauma to work through. So this is a relevant conversation to every single person that's watching right now, big T or small T trauma. Number two, you can't just stop your life. I mean, some people do. Some people go to 21-day treatments or, go to treatment for 6 months, or that's amazing. And I'm very much an advocate of recovery treatment if it's necessary, but not everybody has the privilege of being able to do that. So, or just period. So often we have to show up for our inner world and care for our inner world while living our outer life. And that was the case for me. And so I just want to point out that you don't have to rip off the Band-Aid all at once. You are going to still maintain your coping mechanisms for a while, and you're going to just take it slow and titrate in and titrate out. It's kind of like when you first get sober. Like they're like, okay, you put down the drink and the drug, but if you want to eat a shitload of sugar and smoke cigarettes right now, that's okay. That's okay. Like your sponsor will be like, eat those donuts and smoke those cigarettes, because it's like, if you just try to take it all off at once, it will be too extreme for your system. So to trust that you can live your life and slowly and methodically and therapeutically titrate into this old historical stuff and then come out and be back in your life and then go in and then come out. And that actually is the journey. It's not about really just like blasting yourself open. It's really about taking it slow. That's actually why I have devoted so many different methods in the book that I share about how I spent several years titrating in and out, even really decades, because even all the spiritual work that I had done prior to being 36 years old and remembering the trauma was the foundation with which I was able to continue to go into the deeper work. And so it's been 16 years for me that I've been on this journey of undoing. And the truth is that the deeper you go and the more you committed you are, the faster you will get to freedom. Because the more we avoid, right? So, and the less likely we get there. And I really want to acknowledge too that the path, while it might seem scary, is far less scary than living in denial of the truth.
And so now you're 9 books in, and you started writing books in I believe it was 2011, right? So you're 12 years as a writer. It's a lot of books, Gabby. It's a lot of books on top of the talks and the workshops and the cards and the podcast and the blog and all of that and the kid and the family. You've lived a lot of life in these 40 something years. How do you do it all?
Well, I do it all quite differently now than I used to. So that's good news. I today do it all by really caring for my internal system and showing up for all of the parts of myself that need to be heard and cared for and respected. And sometimes that means saying no to things. And sometimes that means saying yes, but taking a long bath after, or that means asking for help, or that means investing more in support. Because for many years, I didn't live like that. For many years, I was doing all the same things, if not more, without that inner care. And I understand now why I was doing that, like why I lived in such an extreme way, because it was just a form of protecting myself from impermissible historical feelings that I didn't want to face. But having moved through and recovered from and healed and soothed those child parts of myself, I'm now living in a much more resourced way. And in this resourced way of living, I can do less and attract more. I can still do a lot and not burn out. And I can, moment by moment, check in with my own inner system and say, what do you need right now? What do you need right now? Because when we start to establish that relationship with every part of ourselves, and we start to live from a place of this kind of internal parent, right, rather than live from a place of chaos, that that living in that way allows us to show up for our life and do it in a way that is balanced and calm and creative and less extreme.
I watched your Impact Theory show with Tom, and you guys got into this sort of playful debate around patience. And you were kind of implying that, you know, patience is good, and he was saying, I'm not into patience. That's not my thing, and all of that. And in I guess looking at your story now and how your own life has evolved, right? You obviously transition away from forcing things to happen, and we'll get into that a little bit, but into allowing things to happen. And now you sort of mentor a ton of other people, mostly women, I'm assuming, in finding their own purpose, finding their own relationship with their inner voice. And yet you can speak to it so eloquently because you forced things early on, and you had to get burned out, and you had to go through your suicidal ideations, and you had to understand what you understood about mental health. So I'm wondering, can someone truly, truly find their voice without going through all of that?
Yeah, we all go through something. My stories might be far more extreme than somebody else's. My stories might be far less extreme than someone else's. We all have traumas. We all have trauma either with a big T or a small t. So a big T trauma could be, in my case, I revealed that I remembered being sexually abused. In this book, Happy Days, I share the story of remembering. Whereas a small T trauma could be being bullied, which, while it's called a small T trauma, it actually can takes a lot of lives, right? When someone is bullied as a child. So we have all these different ways that we've felt inadequate or unlovable or not good enough in our childhood experience. And then we build up all these different forms of protection to protect against that feeling. And some of us have more extreme protective parts, like addicts or folks who have had big T trauma do bigger things to avoid and anesthetize. But we all have these patterns of pushing down and numbing out the historical experiences of feeling inadequate and unlovable. So whether we have it in an extreme way or we have it in a minor way that's still blocking us from the true successes that we want and the true freedom that we want, the true joy that we want, the true love that we want, we all have this historical wounded child parts of ourselves that deserve our care. And so to really accept that is kind of the first step, is to accept that no matter how good I think everything's been, there's stuff that wasn't, that made an imprint on me. And I've been doing a lot of different things in my life to avoid having to face that feeling. And when I start to accept that and start to notice all the ways that I've been running and avoiding, and then start to care for myself with compassion and curiosity and creativity, and just start to lean into that awareness and self-care of being compassionate towards the ways that we've been overreacting or protecting ourselves, that begins a journey of a total reclaiming of who we really are. Because I see people all the time that are like living seemingly happy lives, but if you really start to talk to them, not that happy, right? Or it looks good on the outside, but if you really get into it, there's some big thing that's a driving force in their life. And that's most people. And so when we become brave enough to start to look at that driving force and care for that driving force, we can begin to soften it. And it's not that we lose our edge. It's just that we soften our edges and we become more of who we really are.
How do you define happiness?
Oh, wow. That's easy for me to say. Happiness is waking up without anxiety every day. Happiness is feeling free in my body and free in my mind. Happiness is being connected to others energetically because of my ability to be present. happiness is just the felt sense of being in a room with a human or a cat or whoever you might love and just experiencing them fully. I mean, truly, to boil it down, happiness is the presence of being present in your life.
Do you think that happiness is something that we should strive for, or is happiness the byproduct of self-care, following our purpose, listening to, like, we don't have to even think about happiness. If we do all these other things, then happiness is sort of the side effect of them.
Well, happiness is our birthright. It's who we are. It is within all of us that if you call it happiness, if you call it freedom, whatever you call it, that inner peace and joy, it's who we are. But really what we've done is built up all these defense mechanisms and protective mechanisms and managers and all these different behavioral patterns against that built up a wall almost against the presence of that joy. And as we start to do spiritual work, and we start to do therapeutic work, and we start to read a book like Happy Days, or to read your future book, whatever it is, to listen and follow you, even on social media, you begin the journey of dismantling the walls that you've built up against the presence of that joy within. And so it's not about striving to get, it's about clearing the space to reconnect to that joy.
When did you realize that you'd found your voice?
3 months ago.
It took you 9 books to realize you had
9 books
found
later.
your voice.
Yeah, I think I'd found my. I think I'd found my voice as a communicator, 16 years ago, but
Right.
and a translator and a teacher. But really, 3 months ago, when I started to do podcasts, like 6 hours a day in this little ISO booth that I'm talking to you in right now, sharing the truthful messages of this book, I realized, wow, Gabby, you're so deeply grounded in the truth of who you are. And you're so present and able to be in connection with humans, even on Zoom, and to feel into their presence and to co-regulate in the moment and be in the seat of your truth. Especially with a book like this, like expressing such profound, vulnerable truths, couldn't come out unless I was really in that, really grounded in my own voice. And so, yeah, I think it really hit me. I think I've always thought that I was connected to my voice, and I have been in many ways always connected to what was coming through me at whatever time it might have been. But it feels like it's really locked into place right now.
Yeah, in the spiritual community, people talk about how they've worked through this or they worked through that, or they're, and you described in your book is you literally went through 4 years of 3 sessions a week of digging through and unpacking your past traumas and on top of dealing with everything else that you're dealing with. And you wrote, I believe, 2 other books during that time. And you were warned 3 other books. You were warned not to speak about it yet because you might accidentally re-traumatize yourself. I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot to process while you're going through your own day-to-day process.
So that's
you've written before about doing the work like a full-time job, and it really has to be that. And look, this is what I do as well. So my whole shtick is to make it such a part of your day that it doesn't feel like you have to be in some privileged position in order to do it, right? You just do it when you can do it, kind of guerrilla style. And I love that that's been your approach as well. And you describe Happy Days as your most spiritual book.
Yeah.
Why is that?
I think that when I submitted this manuscript, I sent it to my publishers and they wrote back and said, we need to talk. And again, this is my 9th book. I'd written, more than half a dozen books with this particular publisher. I was like, what the fuck are you talking about? No one's ever challenged my manuscript because it was always I sent it in clean. It was good work. And it was always like, let's print. Of course, some line edits, but let's print. And this time they were very concerned. So they called me and they said, we're worried about you, Gabby. You're sharing one negative story after the next. You're too vulnerable and you're not showing your true strength. And I responded, my ability to be this vulnerable is my true strength. So thankfully, I stuck to that. And I think that they also were concerned that it was missing some of the spiritual foundation. And some of it meant like those, like sometimes when you paint a painting, sometimes like the last 3 strokes are like what make it Picasso, right? Like whatever it is. So whatever it is you're creating, sometimes like the last few strokes of whatever the creation is, just tip it over the edge. And so while I didn't totally agree with them, I did take it in, and I really, I allowed myself to humbly look at the manuscript from that lens. Okay, well, what's missing here? And it wasn't that the vulnerability was too vulnerable. It wasn't balanced enough with the spiritual message. And in one day of painting with my fingertips on the keyboard, I was able to soften the edges of this book by just adding the core through line, which is that none of this would be my reality without my spiritual foundation. And that's what made this book so excellent, was just because I think when you write a book that has more clinical information, you kind of have to use one side of your brain and then go step away from it to be able to come back to it with that right brain's creative capacity to channel and just really be that kind of messenger. And so I'm super grateful that that message came through them, because it allowed me to come back to the manuscript and say, well, all of these therapies saved my life, but none of them would have been possible without the spiritual through line. And to really put and imprint that message in every single chapter in different ways. And the reason it's my most spiritual book is because I've taught people about manifesting and, of course, meditation and grounding, and all of that is true and real and available to us. But the greatest way to connect to spirit, to a spiritual relationship of your own understanding, is to release the blocks to the presence of that connection that's within you. And that clear portal that is a vessel that we all are to receive that intuitive guidance. And so if we have the desire to just feel the high of a spiritual connection, but not do the deeper work, then we are, in fact, spiritually bypassing. Whereas if we go deeper and we commit to going deeper, we can go in to come out the other side.
How do you distinguish between your inner guidance, like guiding you in the direction of, hey, you should go see a therapist, or you should do this, or you should do that, versus just your conditioning, or maybe even your trauma voice saying, oh, don't do that because that's going to make you more anxious?
Yeah, so I think that it's important to acknowledge that the inner guidance system is very calm and compassionate and courageous and super curious about things. Whereas the ego, the fear part of our mind, the protection mechanisms are extreme, overactivated, controlling, fear-based. And so when you start to see it from that lens, it's pretty easy to decipher, oh, is that my ego or is that my inner guidance system? And you can see it pretty clearly. And it's not about, and when you're listening to your inner guidance system, you don't actually have to be as directive, you're more receptive. So you're literally listening. Oh, okay. Do that thing. Say yes to that. Say no to that. Slow down. Rev up. Whatever it might be. You're in more of a receptive role.
I love that. You said calm, compassionate, courageous, and curious. I don't know if you meant to have all of them start with a C. If that's a part of one of your books.
What I'm referencing actually is in chapter 7 of my book, I introduce internal family systems therapy, which I have used in my own therapy for a decade
Mm-hmm.
with my therapist. And then most recently got trained in the level 1 training of this model, because it's probably the most profound trauma recovery model that I've ever experienced, really any therapeutic model that I've ever experienced, that I wanted to get trained so I could be a support system using this model in my own work. And when I refer to those C qualities, courage, compassion, curiosity, creativity, connectedness, calmness, courage, compassion is the most important one. When we look at these C qualities, these are qualities of self with a capital S. Like you might call that higher self or spiritual presence or the God within us. We all have our own language, the light within us. We all have our own language for how we reference that undamaged, resourced, internal parent, inner guide. And in IFS therapy, what it does is help us connect to those C qualities within ourselves and establish a direct line of connection to that self with a capital S, that self energy. And with that connection, we can let that self be the leader of our experiences rather than all the coping mechanisms, rather than being in the controlling part, or being in the addictive part, or being in the reactive part, or because we have all these different ways of protecting and avoiding and numbing the activated child parts of ourselves, which are known as exiled parts. And so if we're living in exiles get triggered and protector parts get activated and we live there, then it's a very chaotic life to live. Whereas if we start to assume that energy of those self-C qualities, that self energy can start to care for our internal landscape. So it can care for the addict. It can be compassionate towards the controlling part. It can be curious about the part of us that wants to overeat. And when you start to extend these C qualities to these protection mechanisms, you actually start to settle your internal system.
Mm-hmm.
It's
and
a
so
lot.
meditation
It's a lot.
obviously
It's a lot to unpack.
amplifies. Yeah.
So
This
meditation
relationship.
that's right. So meditation is a way of meditation, when used for self-connection, right, is a way of settling the system, settling your nervous system, relaxing the protector parts, right? Because they're all activated, and just relaxing the addict and the controller, so letting them settle, calming the mind, right? So calmness, connectedness. And in that place, when you get into that place of deeper contemplation, that's when the voice of self can be present. That's when you can be journaling after your meditation and hear only words of compassion and just care and kindness and love towards, right? Or you can become curious about. But when meditation is used to get high, right, to get above the feelings, then that's spiritual bypassing. So it's really important to know the difference. Am I intending to use meditation to avoid or numb out or get above a feeling? Or am I allowing it to settle my system so I can become curious about those uncomfortable parts? Or I can extend compassion, or I can develop an inner presence of self-compassion. There's a difference there. And I think it's really important. It's something that I actually never really understood until I became a student of IFS and befriended the founder of IFS. His name is Dick Schwartz. And Dick was really, really open with me about his concern about the spiritual world and all that we do, because he's a very spiritual teacher, even though he's a therapist, but like and in the clinical space, but he's a very spiritual man. That he was like, a lot of people have been using spirituality to get over. It's like almost like the spiritual practice became another form of protection to avoid having to feel deeper feelings. And so we want to make sure that when we're using our spiritual practice, we're using it as a way to connect to our feelings more than get above them.
So obviously your 21-day meditation challenge focuses on that more grassroots connection level of meditation.
Yeah. So the intention of the meditation challenge is to introduce different meditations to people who have a meditation practice or people who don't, and to elevate their practice, or to begin their practice. And then the repetition of that daily habit creates a long-term experience and practice. And what my intention throughout that entire 21 days is to help people connect to self-compassion, to help people feel curious about their inner world, to help them develop that sense of connectedness to themselves, to spirit, to that inner realm, and to connect to that self energy. Exactly.
And for people who hear this conversation and, you know, they're intrigued, maybe they're not as familiar with you as many others are. What's the best, what are the best 2 books to start with? Because you've written so many.
Okay. So there's 3 of my books one of which I would start with. So I've written 9, but there's 3. And I would say, if you're someone who's super new to this work and you're kind of like, I want the light intro, and I want to really, just start to dip my toe in, start with my book, The Universe Has Your Back, because it will help you. It's the subtitle is Transform Fear into Faith. And it will give you a very clear introduction to what it is like to live a spiritual life. And if you're someone who is wanting to really like amplify your life and manifest and just jump right into co-creating a life that you want, then my book, Super Attractor, is a tremendous book in that area. But then if you're living in this time right now, my advice would be, if you're willing to do deeper work, and if you're willing to start to face into some tougher stuff, and you're willing to do what it takes to come back to a place of freedom, then start with Happy Days. But it's nice to be able to offer those 3. Those are my 3 the ones I feel most connected to, and I think the audience as well. But I don't want to discredit the other ones because they're so good too. But I think that those 3 books would be, and if you were to do it in an order and you're completely new, read, oh my God, if in my ideal world, read Happy Days, then read The Universe Has Your Back, then read Super Attractor. Because if you did that, then you're cleaning up your inner world and starting to establish an inner sense of safety, which is the most powerful, profound place to build on a spiritual practice from, rather than building a spiritual practice to avoid that feeling of not being safe. Make sense?
Yeah. And, Deepak has written 80 something books at this point.
I think he's written, I was with him when he published his 90th book.
Okay, there we go. 90 books. And he's what, like 70 something, maybe 80, getting close to 80
I am
years
on
old.
the fast track to Deepak. Yes.
Is that where we're going with all of this?
Maybe. I mean,
not that it's a competition, but it seems like you have a lot to say, and it's very relevant. It's very accessible.
Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if there's, 80 books at that point, but it's not really, for me, there's so much to say. And I live with like a real direct through line of creative source that's always coming through. So every time I say something, I want to share it. And it's not because it's me, it's because I'm listening. It's because I'm a portal, I'm a vessel, as are you, for allowing a sense of my own connection to inner wisdom, and to be a conduit through which divine wisdom can come through. And that might sound heady to people, but it's fucking true. Like when you get out of the way, you can let a powerful presence inform your words and your actions and your books and endless books are possible when you live that inspired connection. And so that's why Deepak's written so many books, because he's super inspired. He just wants to create. And I feel the same.
Final question for you. How do you think about purpose? Because there's the school of thought that you're always on your purpose, whether you realize it or not. There's another school of thought where you choose it, you choose your purpose. And I know you've written about choose again method. And so tell me what your understanding of purpose is these days.
I believe our purpose is to feel safe and to feel joyous and to feel free inside, so that we can be an expression of that freedom in the world in whatever form it comes, whether it comes out as being a secure parent, whether it comes out as being a secure lover or friend or teacher or coworker or boss. I think our purpose really is to come back to that self energy of grace, And when we're there, we can do anything.
If you like that video, you're going to love the next one. Click this thumbnail right here, and I'll see you over there.